white zone is for immediate...
Wait a minute. Have you heard?
This is a show to keep you on the edge of your seat.
Citizens of America,
Welcome to the Radiocast.
Hello and welcome to the Old Time Radiocast. My name is Jack Ryan, and I am one of your hosts for this week as we take a look at the 1951 movie Vengeance Valley. I'm joined today by Jack Kelleher.
Hello.
And Adam Carreiro. How are you guys?
How you guys doing?
Doing great. This was an exciting movie to look at. Our first Western that we've looked at, 1951, Burt Lancaster. Why don't we just start? What are your overall thoughts on the movie? What do we think?
It was definitely a movie that it was a typical Western for back then. It's not like Westerns and movies like now, like you will constantly like watching. I was expecting like a twist to happen or some big event, and this was more just like a storytelling of just how the family just dealt with normal stuff that they did in the Midwest back then. So it wasn't a big epic blockbuster movie, but it was definitely a movie that took the storylines of like what people dealt with back in the day with it.
Yeah, I kind of have a similar opinion of this movie. It definitely isn't one of those a big westerns where there's like a gunfight every 10 minutes. I think there's only like one or two gunfights in the whole movie, so it's definitely more of like a slower paced, more a character study western, and I liked it enough. But personally, I kind of do like the westerns which do have more of the gunfights in them. But yeah, I like this movie.
Yeah, so I knew nothing of this movie going into it. I picked this movie for us to watch because I wanted to watch a Western. I wanted to watch the gunfight, the twists, the bad guy, the outlaw, the deputy, the sheriff. And I think it had a lot of the Western tropes, but it was a lot of that just this is Western life. At some point, like in, towards the middle of it, I was like, oh, this is almost just kind of like a family, drama almost just that takes place in the Wild West. But it was overall, I thought it was great. So the plot, we have Burt Lancaster playing Owen Daybright, and Owen Daybright is an adopted son of a farmhand. I thought that was just an interesting little trope. Is that something that's seen before? I thought that was just, I don't know. He could have just been a regular son, but I don't know if that was something that was seen a lot in the Western, that they adopted people to help out or something. But
I think people like what kind of made this a little not so much easier but more to compare is the TV show Yellowstone that's out now. So that kind of shows like the way current, like up to date kind of stuff. And it does have more action and more like fighting in that, but kind of still the family dynamics of storytelling, like bringing somebody in and making them part of the family by working through just like Yellowstone does. So they kind of did it this way too, that you work hand in your family, but yet you're not like in the circle of the family. And especially when the daughter gets pregnant and has the child too, it's kind of one of those that they're part of the family, but they still have like that little asterisk being part of the family kind of thing.
Yeah. I think I remember, I might be misremembering this, but I'm pretty sure there's a scene where Burt Lancaster's character Owen and his adopted dad were talking about how he found him in an orphanage or something like that, or was it he found him like working at another farm? I forget how exactly they ended up meeting, but I'm pretty sure there's a scene where they explained.
I think I know the scene where you're talking about, and he's saying like I ended up needing you more than you needed me or something like that, and he explains. I forget exactly the beginning though, but it did. I think he was there mainly for work. I don't know. He could have been there as a child, but mainly to work, I believe.
Yeah, I don't think he brought him from a different farm. But I think, I don't know if it was from a family, like he lost his family, or if it was an orphanage.
So that's one thing with this movie that I kind of felt the whole way through. With a lot of Westerns, you kind of have the main protagonist and the bad guy. And, you those are clearly defined roles. And here there was a lot of I was really confused on lots of the connections between the characters, between, you know, say Lily, the mother of the baby, and Jennifer and Lee, all these characters. They were really like tied together in different ways, in the family ways. And I think it kind of struck me that that's what this movie was about more than, you know, guns and horses.
Yeah, it was still that like that family dynamic. Like they all connected, they're all family, but they all have different paths that they either got together or different paths that they coexist with each other.
Yeah, you mentioned that it's mostly about family. Yeah, like the main struggle of this movie is definitely between Owen and his adopted brother Lee, who and kind of like the rising tensions between them, which ultimately do end in a gunfight at the end of the movie. As for some of the roles, the woman Lily who gets pregnant, she's separate from the family. She's definitely a neighbor who lives in the area, and she also has an interesting family dynamic herself with her brothers. There's also some conflict there as well.
Right? Don't they end up in jail for a little bit?
Yeah, then they end up in the gunfight at the end.
Right. Yeah. So everyone kind of comes out of nowhere, but definitely, going into this, I definitely thought it was gonna be, you know, Wild West, gunfights and all that, but no, definitely wasn't. But it's still, I'm still a very big fan of the movie, and a lot of the different tropes it has. My favorite thing about the movies, though, I think it looks beautiful. For 1951, it's in color, it's in Technicolor, and I think a lot of the landscapes were absolutely gorgeous.
Oh yeah, the landscape shots especially stood out to me, particularly in the last third, where it's a lot of them going out and rounding up just these huge, like mile-long herds of cattle. And nowadays, like that would all be CG probably, but back then they really had to get all like those hundreds and hundreds of cows and get them to move correctly in the scene. And there was a lot of really good landscape shots, especially in that last third.
I had the same thought that like nowadays that would be 100% CG. You wouldn't have a director that would be like, all right, we need to buy 1,000 cows for these two shots, you know. But I think it worked well. It was beautiful.
Yeah, it definitely be very limited unless you really go to a cattle farm itself and like work with a cattle farm to film it.
Right.
That would be the only way. Like, yeah, you're definitely not getting your production team and getting an open field. It's like, oh, we'll just bring the cattle in here. It's like you're either CGIing or if you're literally filming on a cattle farm.
Right. And I don't know precisely. I know this was filmed in the West at the time. It was the 50s. It's Western Colorado where this was filmed, which is all those beautiful landscapes. I don't know if they filmed like on a location, if they picked a small town in there, or if they made a set. Do either of you know?
There wasn't too many production notes about this movie that I could find. I did do my best to try and research it. I couldn't really find any answers on like where they filmed it, how many sets they had to build, or even where they got all the cows from. But yeah, I did read, and you mentioned this in the opening for the, like in the intro for the movie, that this was based on a book. Yeah, it was based on a book by the same name by author Luke Short, whose real name was Frederick Glidden. Like the name Luke Short, it was kind of his professional name, was actually the same name as a gunslinger from the Old West, which makes sense because he primarily wrote Western novels, 10 of which were made into movies, and this was one of them.
10, wow, that's a lot of books to be made.
Yeah, I looked at some of the other movies that were based on his books. I wasn't really as familiar with them, like kind of like with Vengeance Valley itself. But apparently he was a pretty popular author, because I did read that like two famous people who were fans of his books were President Harry Truman and President Dwight Eisenhower. So he definitely had a following.
Yeah.
And probably with like those two presidents, those more are like Midwest kind of presidents. So it's probably his writing style probably got that culture. And that's why. And the movie was popular too, because it did make a profit back then. So the movie itself was popular too. So I think it hit this way the story was written was it hit, like people could relate to it, that it didn't need like big productions or any kind of big action sequence to really tell a story.
Right, and it was still made in a time where like the Wild West is at the top of the game, where
Yeah.
you could just make a Western movie and it would make money because people are just so interested in what's going on out there. And I was thinking during the movie how, I don't know, just the tropes of an American Western movie and how specific they are and how you really don't see them anymore. You see a lot of like parts of them, like a lot of the dueling sequences are now, you know, off of gunslinger scenes from old Westerns and stuff like that. But you don't see like any true American Westerns being made anymore. But during this time, you'd pop off 10 of these a year, you know, and they'd all make money.
Yeah, especially nowadays, you see more of like the revisionist Western movies that kind of started, I think, in the 80s or 70s. Like Clint Eastwood, a lot of his Westerns are kind of what people call a revisionist Westerns, where they're not as, they show a very unromanticized and more grittier version of the West. And like, say, earlier films like the John Ford Western movies show a more like romanticized version of the West, of whereas like the cowboys and the Indians, where nowadays it's kind of, if there's a Western movie, it's usually a lot more grittier and more like usually doesn't have a happy ending, I've noticed.
That, and they focus more, like now the Westerns is more like outlaws, so it's always like either a sheriff being the hero going after a villain, or it's about like a certain outlaw like Butch Cassidy. And I'm blanking on the Netflix one that was just last year that had like Alba and a couple other actors in it that was kind of popular, but it was about
I think that's Harder They Fall.
Yeah. So that was another one that was like broke out of jail and how they're surviving and they're getting chased. So it's more like outlaw type. You don't get like these family type. Like the only thing I could think of was how Yellowstone is like family oriented, or now all the spin-offs coming from it. But yeah, there's really not too much. Like a lot of times is action. They really don't show. If they do get a story that is focused on a family type or how things live, how they live during a time period, it's more they'll add like an event that is action or something. Like they couldn't have no like gunslinger, but like they could have had like an action sequence, like they're doing the herd of the cows and it rains and there's a flood, so they got to get the cows over the river. Right. And like some action sequence like that. It has nothing to do with Western Indians and cowboys, but had that in, and they didn't even do something like that. They stayed more focused for the story aspect and the character development of it.
Right. There's not like the eye grabbing, oh, this is what it is, but
Yeah.
like it's just, this is life, you know? It was hard. You know,
Yeah,
people want to see it. Yeah. But still very interesting. I liked I found it was so interesting. Mainly the whole plot of the movie is surrounding the birth of an illegitimate child. You know, someone, Lily, the girl, has a child out of wedlock. And I thought it was just so interesting how aggressive that was attacked by everyone there. Because, like, in today's standards, that's, you know, it happens all the time. But, like, one of the first scenes, they go into the bar, and I think there's a doctor in there. And the doctor's saying, no, I wouldn't come help deliver that child because I don't know who the father was. And it's like, oh, that's so aggressive.
Yeah, I think he said, I don't remember exactly what he said, but he said, like, I'll go when the father comes and asks me to, and I doubt that will happen. And
Right.
yeah, like, Lily has had, like, this baby out of wedlock, and it did strike me just everyone's reaction to it. There were a few sympathetic people like Owen and Jen and that older lady who Lily would later move in with in the movie. But yeah, everyone else was just kind of shunning her, and like her two brothers like willing to kill someone because of this. And yeah, like they come in like, and they're like, who's the father? We're gonna kill him. And and speaking of the father, the baby, I was at first convinced that it was Owen who was the father, because him and Lee come back from getting cattle. They go into the tavern, and everyone's like, hey, did you hear about Lily? She's pregnant. And then Owen and Lee just kind of share a oh crap look. And then Owen shows up at her door with money for her and the baby. And just like the way, or has the baby, oh wait, the baby's already been born.
Yeah, but that's
sorry, I
yeah,
forgot.
yeah.
And like just the way he looks at the baby and smiles, I was like, okay, he's the father. And I was thinking about like how I was like, okay, it's kind of interesting how they didn't have to tell us. Just from his reaction, we can tell he's the father. Then come to find out the next scene is actually Lee, his married brother, who's the father. That actually surprised me when that twist happened, because I was sort of naively immediately assumed it was Owen who was the father.
Yeah, that's definitely what they wanted you to think. That was definitely like that's what Lee wanted. You know what I mean? That was the point of the movie. But I definitely thought so too, and I thought that's what it was gonna go off of from there, like how he deals with, dealing with this illegitimate child. But no, it's just he's a nice dude, which I really liked. He was just one of the few good people in the movie.
Yeah, he was willing to cover for his. He kind of like really takes the brunt of everyone's suspicion from Lee, because this baby is born. We don't know who the father is. Suddenly he shows up to give the mother and child like $500, I believe it was. So everyone's like, oh, he's the father, of course. And then Lily's two brothers are immediately trying to find any excuse to kill him. Meanwhile, Lee is just kind of hiding off, trying to avoid suspicion.
Right, and there's even a point where I think Jennifer is saying like, you should stay away from Lily. Like, people are like, don't you hear all the bad things people are saying? And Owen's like, I like her. She's a nice girl. Like,
Yeah.
People shouldn't be saying all these bad things. But I don't know. I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I do agree. The baby, like the baby in the question of who is father is definitely kind of the inciting incident of the movie, which sort of sets the stage for all the future conflicts, like between Owen and Lily's brothers, and then between Owen and Lee, because Lee, who is married, is the father, but he doesn't want this getting out, and Owen tries to cover for him, unintentionally kind of covers for him by just unintentionally kind of becoming like the most obvious sort of suspect. But then as the film goes on and the tension between Owen and Lee grows more and more, Lee very quickly throws Owen under the bus and like tells Lily's brothers like, oh yeah, it was totally Owen, you should go and kill him.
Well, is there ever, now that I'm trying to think back, is there ever a scene where Owen is just straight up like, no, it's not me? Does he ever just say that? Or does he always just like fighting people off and just being, because now that I think about it, I don't think he ever is.
No, I think it's more he's just defending it, like
Right.
the honor.
He never just flat out says like, no, it's not me, stop doing this.
Yeah. So he's more just sticking up.
Yeah.
Yep. And earlier you mentioned like the reason why Owen was adopted. I think it's also there to kind of add more tension between Owen and Lee, because if they were biological brothers, it would be not. I think like there'd be less reasons for Lee to be jealous, versus Owen is his adopted son, who is clearly, as the film goes on, who their father definitely seems to prefer Owen over Lee. And Owen then kind of just proves to be sort of superior to Lee in every way. Like, he's better at wrestling cattle. He's better at riding horses than Lee is. He has a better temper than Lee does. So, and just kind of as the movie goes on, we see Lee kind of proves to be the more ineffective of the brothers. And since, like, he's the biological son who's supposed to inherit this farm, and clearly his father prefers his other kid who's not even his actual son. Like that's definitely a source of tension between the two characters.
Yeah, there's a scene where Lee goes to the father, Archie, and he's talking to him about the farm and how something about getting a raise or something, and eventually Archie comes and he says, you do deserve something from me, and I'll give you half the farm when I'm done, and Owen gets the other half. And you can see like that's where Lee gets pushed over the top. That's where he says, all right, I'm gonna go out on this, take these cattle, go out, and that's where the really climax starts in the movie. But yeah, it is because the father is preferring Owen over his real kid. Yeah.
It's more just Owen getting the respect, while Lee is more just almost getting the entitlement of it. So he just thinks like, no, this is how it goes.
Right.
And Owen just working in just earning the respect, and that's what it turns out to be the higher quality.
About halfway when that scene happened, I don't know if have you guys seen the movie Gladiator, but it
Yes.
reminded me of the movie Gladiator of the father, I forget it, Marcus Aurelius gives his power to not his child, some other dude who he adopted through time, and the real child gets upset. I thought, it was like, oh, it's pretty similar to that, and I thought, interesting.
Now that you mentioned that, it is a very similar situation, and Lee is kind of similar to Commodus. Maybe not as not as psychopathic at all, but it's a bit similar as kind of the jealous son brother figure who's trying to undermine the sibling who the father prefers.
Right, and then you have the good guy who's always doing nice, and he gets thrown under the bus or thrown into the gladiator ring.
Yeah, and like mentioning Lee, he's played by the actor Robert Walker, who before this I knew him as the villain of the Alfred Hitchcock movie Strangers on a Train. He's the villain of that movie, and it actually came out the same year as this film, 1951. And unfortunately, in 1951 was also the year that Robert Walker would pass away at like from an accidental overdose at tragically a very young age. So this was one of his last movies, like Vengeance Valley.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And it was and speaking of actors, it was also Burt Lancaster's first Western. He would later go on to be in several Westerns, and this was his first. And Burt Lancaster is kind of one of those classic Hollywood actors, but he's someone who wasn't too familiar with before this. I believe I'd only seen him in one other movie, which was the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, which is about where he plays a Nazi judge on trial for war crimes. So it's a very, very different role. It's kind of actually like similar to what I read about Burt Lancaster's career itself, is that he was known very early on in his career for playing the tough guys who had a tender heart. And we can kind of clearly see in Vengeance Valley that is the role he's playing. And as his career went on, he became known for playing more complex and challenging roles, which is what I knew him as his role as the judge in Judgment at Nuremberg.
Those are very different roles. I think this is the only thing I've seen him in, but I was definitely familiar with his name when I saw it on the cover of the movie. You know?
Yeah, he's one of those guys who I was familiar with him more than I had actually seen him in. Something else that I have seen him in is the movie Field of Dreams. He shows up in at the end. He's the older version of Ray Liotta's character, I believe.
I saw he was credited in that, and I couldn't think in my head who he could have been.
Yeah, he has a small cameo at the end as like an older version of a character. And I know he's also famous for a role called The Birdman of Alcatraz, where he plays a real life person. And there's a few other roles of his I've heard of, but yeah, until this, I'd only really seen him in 2 other movies.
And back then, too, like a lot of actors, unless you got cast with either a company or a certain director, like they're not in like tons of movies like throughout the year. Like now, actors can be like in 4 movies in 1 year, and that's how they become a household name. When movie stars, like back then, like you really were in like 1-2 films a year. So unless you made it big either with somebody on the cast that already had a big name, it's really hard to get a well-known name to keep going through. Like back then, some of the actors.
And you said this was his first Western. Was he a well-known name before this movie, or was he like a nobody at this time?
I want to say he wasn't that well known, but I think he's had a couple beforehand.
Right.
I would have to look at his filmography again to see what roles he was in before.
With Burt Lancaster, I think this draw for this movie was the storyline and the novel being that well known, but also the Technicolor. Like this is kind of when like really color movies were starting to build up. So I think that's what kind of helped this, because now you can go see a Western that's not black and white. And I don't know when John Wayne's first color movie was for Western, but like to get those big names, like they were already names in black and white. So I think that what Burt Lancaster was like kind of going up against going into the Western.
Yeah, Probably also just back then, at least compared to other movies, westerns are probably a bit cheaper to make. So it was probably just like, as an early actor, him just looking for a role. And I did read that like a lot of the people in this movie, kind of involved in this movie, were kind of mostly known for doing westerns, because it was written by an author who primarily wrote westerns.
Yeah.
And the director, whose name I used to have,
Richard Thorpe.
Richard Thorpe. I was looking at his filmography. He mostly just did western or like these action adventure movies. And so this was kind of seemed like a usual film for him. And the actress who plays Joanne Drew, was primarily known for starring in western films and appearing in western television shows. Even though I guess she had a phobia of horses, which just kind of makes it a bit ironic that she was in all these westerns.
Yeah, back then westerns were like the main draw for people. Like you can go the 1950s, yeah, probably like in the 70s, like when you have like touching back on presidents like Ronald Reagan and that, being fans of all like the western movies and that culture coming up too. So the westerns were during this time period was really not the heyday, but really the like production companies knew that this was the money maker and this is what drew people in for it.
Right.
And that's why I had the Red Ryder rifle BB gun and cowboys and Indians and all that. So, but this is definitely one of those one story or movies that kind of just sets their own pace compared to all the other things going on, like with like on TV, Bonanza, and can't think of the other TV show that was kind of up on that one.
Gunsmoke or The Rifleman.
I think it might have been Gunsmoke was the ranch, right? There was like a ranch one. Maybe it's not Gunsmoke. I know there was another one that's like a ranch type around that same time period too. So like this movie just kind of would draw in that crowd, but still make as much profit, just being nothing to do with cowboys and Indians and horses. It's just more family life and cattle.
Right. I was surprised especially now that it's in the public domain and MGM dropped it. They just didn't want to really renew the license. I figured it would have been like a small budget, didn't make any money movie. But, it was $1 million and it made probably close to another $1 million in box office. But it made money. It definitely made money.
Yeah, it made a little over almost 3 between U.S. and Canada. Canada made almost $2 million. I mean, U.S. I'm sorry, made almost $2 million. So back then, that's pretty good for a movie.
Yeah, it's in today's money, yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, it's surprising that they dropped this, made it available to the public. But thank God for us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's probably like I was reading that like at the time there was like a lot of films from like that era that, well, like at the time it was a Metro. A Goldwyn Mayer was the company this was under.
Yeah.
MGM. Yeah, like I think there's a lot of like a lot of the lesser known films they would not really like fight to keep the copyright for. It's more like the more well known, famous, like big Oscar winning grand epic films that they would fight to keep the copyright for, and other ones like this which did well which did well successfully but wasn't as well known. They probably thought it's not really worth the effort of like fighting to keep the copyright for, like we can afford to let that one go.
Yeah, around this time MGM was still being one of the powerhouses. It wasn't until later in the century that it kind of fell through and got bought out. So this is probably just during their time that it's like, no, we can survive doing it. And now Foresight would be like, we should just try to not pay this one and pay this one and vice versa. But yeah, it probably definitely during this time when they decided not to was probably still with MGM was one of the powerhouse movie production companies.
Oh yeah, like now that I think about it, you were talking about like earlier we mentioned like recent westerns. A recent western that this reminded me of, I don't know if you saw it, it came out 2 years ago, 1 year ago. It's called The Power of the Dog, starring Benedict Cumberbatch.
I've not.
It's similar but different to this movie in that it's a Western that there isn't any like cowboys and Indians or gunfights. It's more of like about similar to this kind of like a family drama, and like more about like a character study. And there kind of is like a similar, well, not exactly similar, but there is a brother relationship between two brothers where there is a lot of tension between them. Benedict Cumberbatch's character and his brother, played by Jesse Plemons in the movie, and it is a bit similar to this one in that there is no gunfights, no like chases, no fighting, but like a lot of like character drama is what the movie's about.
Yeah, I definitely expected this to be. I think I've only seen a handful of westerns in my life, maybe 5 or 6, but they all have those same cowboys and natives and gunfights, and definitely wasn't disappointed by this movie at all. But I was expecting that. But you get a little bit of like a gunfight in the end. You get like a standoff. I thought it was a good ending to the movie in general. Owen ends up shooting Lee, and then he tells Archie what happens, and that's the end of the movie. But I thought it was a satisfying ending, to say the least.
Yeah, I was actually surprised that Owen survived, because throughout the movie there was a narrator, and that's kind of a big Western trope itself, a movie being narrated. And at the end, it's kind of revealed that it was being narrated by a supporting character named Huey. And because there was this other character who was talking about Owen as the movie went on, I was like, okay, Owen's probably going to die at the end of this because everyone in town seems to want to kill him.
Right, or else he'd be narrating.
Yeah, or else he'd be narrating. But then when he survived, I was like, okay, that's a bit surprising. And then that just got me thinking, I was like, wait, why was there even a narrator in this movie? Kind of didn't really seem to add a whole lot the more I thought about it. Maybe the whole purpose was to make us think that Owen was going to die, because usually when there's these movies, when there's another supporting character narrating about the main character's life and like describing events that person did, usually that means that character's going to die at the end. So maybe that was a trope that they knew people were aware of, and they were trying to subvert expectations. Or maybe Huey's narration was a bit more had more presence in the book itself, and they had to copy it over because it was an adaptation.
I do wonder how true this stayed to the book. I'm certainly not going to read the book, but there's really not enough information about this story or this movie, but I wish I could know how true it stayed to the book. I wonder if it's just a copy, almost shot for shot, or if they tweaked a lot of things. I do not know.
There was probably like knowing most books like this, there was probably like subplots that got cut out, like because there's a sort of a subplot of Huey who ends up being the narrator, and like Huey, who's kind of a young like ranch hand, he has a crush on Lily, the girl who gets pregnant at the beginning, and it's sort of touched upon in the movie, but that's probably something that the book like goes further into. And there's also like sort of a hinted at romance between Owen and Jen, because Lee is a pretty bad husband, as we see throughout the movie. So those are probably themes that the movie, like aspects that the book like goes further into.
Yeah, you always get more information with the book.
And with this like being made from MGM, it's like nowadays you almost might think like this could have been an independent movie, but because it was made by such a big production company, it's one of those movies that you would think just didn't pan out, but it made a profit. So it's kind of just, it's more like the behind the scenes of this movie, why it didn't either go and make people more famous or the director doing more of these type of movies.
Well, Burt Lancaster would certainly go on and become famous.
Right, yeah.
So it definitely succeeded in that. Though, yeah, it probably had, because I did check, this movie currently stands at 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, so it definitely got good reviews when it came out, or at least everyone currently working at Rotten Tomatoes who has seen it has liked it.
Yeah.
So it definitely wasn't like it bombed or anything. So probably just because in the early, especially in the early 50s, there was probably, especially from MGM, they were just probably churning out so many westerns, like the John Wayne westerns and other films like that. This one probably more like fell under the radar, which may explain why later MGM would like drop the copyright in 1979.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that, or it's like something like behind the scenes. Somebody didn't like someone, or they had their own drama that's like non-family that happened behind the scenes kind of stuff that turned and be like, it definitely was a subject with like the having the outcast son and not the father, like no father for the baby. It was definitely a topic around that time area was tough, but I know it didn't give a year that they dropped the copyright. It just said it's 28th.
Like I read it was 1979.
1979
was when the film entered the public domain. And yeah, I do have to say for a film about the 50s, even though it touches upon the sort of the taboo aspect of Lily having a child out of wedlock, the film never shames her for like doing that. It definitely shames Lee for cheating on his wife and having the baby, but the film like never shames Lily for having this child out of wedlock. And for 1951 film, I was genuinely surprised by that because the 50s weren't known for being very progressive towards this depiction of women.
Yeah, it just did it did it on the topic, not so much on the person.
Yeah,
right.
Of it,
All the blame was on the missing father.
Yeah.
So there was really no one to throw the blame at. Yeah, Lee, but
yeah, it was definitely a movie that you kind of expect one thing, so you're kind of sitting there just waiting, and then really like figuring out the storyline like during it. Like I don't know, like nowadays you'll see trailers and promos, and back then there wasn't that much, so I don't know what they did kind of to how they promoted this besides being like in Technicolor,
right?
Like how if they promoted it more as like a love romance movie, or like there wasn't so much drama. Like the genre of drama wasn't really like the drama of now to can create like thriller or suspense, so it wasn't like that either. So I don't know if they really promoted it as like a drama type of movie.
Yeah, I'm looking up at your notes, which has the movie's poster, and that is a bit of a deceptive poster.
Yeah, it's just
because it looks like it features Owen, and I think that's Jen.
Yep.
Sort of embraced, and he's like holding a gun out aimed at something off screen as if like they're like facing down someone, and that's not exactly the movie we get.
No, so that's why it almost looks like it makes it look like a drama, but it is a type of a drama, but it's not like a thriller suspense drama like you normally see.
Right. Yeah, like movie posters, especially posters back then, can be very deceptive. Where I think we touched upon this in a previous Radiocast. It was the Radiocast for Dementia 13 I mentioned. No, I think I mentioned after we did it that the poster for that movie is advertising a completely different movie than what the movie actually is. So yeah, that was probably just the studio, like some person at the studio saying like we need to make this look like a big movie with gunfights and stuff. So just slap this deceiving poster on it and let's call it a day.
Yeah,
all the way. Something I liked about the movie, I liked how the world kind of felt like lived in. You know, I didn't really feel it felt real to me. That I wasn't like, oh, this is a movie, this is a bad story, but it felt like these characters were living this life. And right from the start of the narration, you get right into it. And maybe they could just be the way Westerns are and how believable it is because they're shooting it on location out there and all that. But I really did believe a lot of the acting. I thought the acting was great from everybody, not just Burt Lancaster. And whether it was the writing or the directing, but the world felt lived in. It felt like a real little town.
Yeah, I think another reason for that I noticed in terms of like the set design is they never were like in like a town street or town square too often, where like say from the show A Bonanza that there was a lot of scenes of them walking down the street, and I could tell like, yeah, that's on like a stage somewhere like that. I was like, yeah, they built this whole town in a back street, but like, sort of because most of the film takes place on the ranch, which looks like an actual ranch, it makes it feel more realistic versus if they were just on a set that looked like a set. Like this actually looks like a actual farm that they're at, so it kind of does add more realism. Like it by like not like if they had like been on a set that like looked like someone had like hammered and nailed together, it would have kind of taken you out of it, being like, oh, that's just a movie set back there. But like, no, it looks like it's actually on an actual ranch.
Totally, and those landscapes add so much to the movie.
Yeah.
So that's going to be about it for this episode of the Radiocast. We hope you enjoyed Vengeance Valley with Burt Lancaster, directed by Richard Thorpe. It was a great Western. We're happy we take a look at it. So for Jack Kelleher, Adam Carreiro, we're going to wrap things up. Thank you so much for listening and for watching.